Hi there, welcome back. As promised, I am back with the second part of the story, The Great Stone Face. And before we read this story, let's do a quick recap. So, in the first part of the story, we read about Ernest, who as a little boy was in awe of the greatness and benevolence of the Great Stone Face. When he was a kid, his mother had told him about a prophecy that someone with the same face would be born in the valley someday. When he grew up into a young man, he still hoped for the prophecy to come true. Then one day, rumors about a man with the same face of the great mountain wonder had come back. So according to these rumors, he was to return to the valley. Now, to Ernest's dismay, this man called Gathergold did not bear any resemblance to the mighty mountain. Many years passed by then, and Ernest came to be known as quite an industrious, hardworking, friendly, neighborly kind of boy. And although he would spend his hours looking at the Great Stone Face, people didn't really mind it. Then once again, rumors started to fly around, and it went all around the valley, and that this man who looked like the Great Stone Face, it seems, but was a general in his time. Okay, once again, the crowds gathered to look at this man. But again, Ernest found that this man did not resemble the Great Stone Face. Disappointed as he was, he heard his inner voice consoling him and telling him to be patient. Thereafter, many years passed. With time, Ernest turned into a middle-aged man. According to his unsuspecting neighbors, he was nothing more than an ordinary familiar face who was also humble, hardworking, and thoughtful as a person. But what about the old prophecy? Was it ever fulfilled? The Great Stone Face, Part 2. The years hurried on and brought white hairs upon the head of Ernest, and made wrinkles across his forehead and furrows on his cheeks. He was an old man, but not in vain had he grown old. More numerous than the white hairs on his head were the wise thoughts in his mind. And Ernest had ceased to be obscure. Unsought for, undesired, had come the fame which so many seek. He had become famous beyond the limits of the valley. College professors and even the active men of the cities came from far to see and converse with Ernest, and he received them with gentle sincerity and spoke freely with them of whatever came uppermost or lay deepest in his heart or their own. While they talked together, his face would brighten unawares and shine upon them as with mild evening light. While Ernest had been growing up, God granted a new poet to this earth. He too was a native of the valley, but had spent the greater part of his life in distant cities, pouring out his sweet music everywhere. Neither was the Great Stone Face forgotten, for the poet had celebrated it in a poem. The songs of this poet found their way to Ernest. He read them after his customary toil, seated on the bench before his cottage door. As he read, he lifted his eyes to the mountain. "O Great Stone Face," he said, "is not this man worthy to be your likeness?" The face seemed to smile, but did not answer. Now it happened that the poet, though he lived so far away, had not only heard of Ernest, but had thought so much about his character and wished to meet this man whose wisdom walked hand in hand with the noble simplicity of his life. One summer day, therefore, he arrived at Ernest's door, where he found the good old man holding a book in his hand, which he read, and then, with a finger between the leaves, looked lovingly at the Great Stone Face. "Good evening," said the poet. "Can you give a traveler a night's shelter?" "Gladly," answered Ernest. And then he added, smiling, "I think I never saw the Great Stone Face look so hospitably at a stranger." The poet sat down beside him, and he and Ernest talked together. Never before had the poet talked with a man like Ernest, so wise and gentle and kind. Ernest, on the other hand, was moved by the living images flung out of the poet's mind. As Ernest listened to the poet, he imagined that the great stone face was bending forward to listen too. He gazed into the poet's eyes. "Who are you, my gifted guest?" he asked. The poet laid his finger on the book Ernest had been reading. "You have read these poems," said he. "You know me then, for I wrote them." Let's understand what we've read. So as the years passed, Ernest grew into an old man. Grey hair on his head, wrinkles on his face. As he grew older, he became wiser, and Ernest was no longer unknown to people. It was a time when he had become so famous beyond the limits of the valley even. From far and wide, people of different professions came to see and converse with Ernest, and he received them with gentle sincerity and spoke very freely to them. While they talked together, his face would brighten and shine upon them. Now this time there also lived a poet, and he too was a native of the valley, but he spent a greater part of his life traveling elsewhere. And the fact that the poet had not forgotten the great stone face was evident in his poems. Now Ernest would also read the poet's songs regularly. He was, after all, the greatest admirer of the great stone face. And apart from reading the poems, he would even ask the great stone face if this poet was the man that the prophecy was about. But the face never answered. Now Ernest had become so famous that even the poet had heard of him. He was keen to meet Ernest, and he believed that Ernest's wisdom was similar to the noble simplicity of life itself. Then there came a summer day, when the poet arrived at Ernest's door, and he found him reading a book. As Ernest turned the pages, he looked lovingly at the great stone face. The poet greeted him and requested for a night's shelter. Ernest was so glad enough to be of assistance to the poet. He even said that he had never seen the great stone face look so hospitably at a stranger. Probably these were Ernest's own feelings that were reflected on the great stone face. The poet sat down beside him, and they spoke for hours. It may sound strange, but never before had the poet interacted with a man so wise, gentle, and kind. Ernest, on the other hand, was moved by the creativity of the poet's mind. As Ernest listened to the poet, he imagined that even the great stone face was bending forward to listen to the poet. He gazed into the poet's eyes and asked him who he was, and the poet pointed out to the book that Ernest had been reading and made a startling revelation. He said that the one who has written the poems was him. Do you think this poet could be the man who resembles the great stone face? All to find out. On that note, I will take your leave. Keep looking for me in more upcoming inspirational lessons. Until then, see you and take care. Tutormate. For more amazing video lectures, download the free app on the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store.